Hey, good morning. Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good day. Hope some of you have been able to get out into the shop and start making a few chips this morning. Before we get really going, I want to thank everybody for your patience last week. It was really a bad week. I don't know what I had. I don't know if it was a mild case of the flu or what, but I never really got super feverish or anything like that. A little bit, but I sounded like a goose trying to honk down a well or through the end of a railroad tunnel or something like that with a train coming by. So it was not a good week. But thanks for hanging in, and thanks for all the well wishes and everything of folks saying get well soon and what have you. I was never really super sick. I was just in general felt like I'd been rode hard and put away wet. So, but thank you for all the well wishes. I really do appreciate that. So, doing fine. Let's see who we got out here. Number one, we got Dave Gatton, CNC master, and Mr. John DeRoos. Howdy do. Kevin Els, David Crook, Joni Jensen. How you doing, Miss Joni? And Dave Kraus, Chad M. Welcome aboard, y'all. This morning's video. And good morning, Alan. How you doing? Staying up late with us, I see. Terrific. Glad to see you. This morning's video was about the difference basically between tapered ball nose bits and standard ball nose bits. I know it's kind of a strange question to be answering and a strange video to make, but I've had several questions on it and folks were a little bit confused. And it was mainly about the difference between the two and why you would want to use a tapered ball nose. And the main difference is basically so that taper can clear away that vertical edge that might get in the way of the shank of the ball nose bit. So that's the major advantage. And then I also had a bunch of questions on how the heck do I get this entered in a tool database? And basically cheat. Cheat. You can do that with most bits. Some things to be careful on, though, are like roundover bits and any kind of a profiling bit. Because if the profile style is a little bit different, the preview is not going to match up, and you may run into some problems running into clamps or what have you. And as soon as I get the bit, it's on order. I'm going to be doing a video on some roundover bits made for the CNC, the type that will plunge in and start cutting and just round over your project, what have you. Let's see. We also had Big Bear 4x43, Mike Haichu, Landis Stutes, Joni has a question. Didn't get to see it all, but is there a time you wouldn't use a tapered ball nose? That's all I have. There's not really a time that I can think of where you wouldn't use a tapered ball nose, just a time that it's not really necessary or it you have the option to use it. There's no. It's that's hard to say. There's no real disadvantage in using a tapered ball nose, other than the fact that they're expensive, and standard ball noses are cheaper. So if you are cutting something real shallow that you don't need to worry about a clearance, like if you're engraving a photograph or something like that. If you wanted to use a standard ball nose rather than to save your tapered ball nose, you could. Like that's why I got that 3/64 inch ball nose. The this itty bitty puppy right here. That's why I got that, was to engrave photos. And this is like $7 compared to $40 for a tapered ball nose. So I just soon burn that up, dull that up rather than burn up the tapered ball nose. So that would be the only time that I would probably tend to use a standard ball nose versus the tapered. But you break standards? Yeah, I break bits. So that's how I know. Start gentle. So that was the other part of that was rather than damage a tapered ball nose, which is pretty pricey, by plunging it straight in and just start carving away using that offset strategy. Go ahead and use the raster strategies to let it ease into that dish and get it cleaned up. So, yeah, my favorite story is I got a brand new 23 thousandths diameter bit for cutting fret slots in fretboards, and opened up in a little package like this one here, and this Kyocera 3/64 bit, the bit actually rests and nests into the bottom of the tube. And the 23 thousandths bit wasn't like that. It was just loose in the tube and had a little bit of packing up here at this end so it didn't break the tip. And I opened up the tube and promptly dropped it. It fell on the ground and snapped the tip right off. Of course, it landed tip down and snapped that tip right off. It never saw a piece of material. So there went $20 out the window right there. So now, whenever I'm using these small bits, I have an old mouse pad I throw up on the CNC table, and I open up my containers above that mouse pad. So if it drops, and they do, if it drops, it lands on that mouse pad. So avoid breakage that way. But that can get real expensive real fast. So were there any questions on anything I covered in the video at all? I mean, I try to be thorough, and sometimes I go way overboard. I did have a comment on the video that Tools Today does have tool files, tool database files for some of their bit sets. So you don't have to download the entire amount of catalog. You can go in if you have some of their bit sets. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to that in the description of this video after it goes live and becomes a video. But you don't have to download the entire tool catalog. You can get the just the tool files for a bit set. But they no longer have the Vectric tool files for the individual bits on the website. They used to. I don't know why they took those down. I guess they want you to download the entire library now. So let's see. David Crook watched your video of tapered ball nose bits this morning and I have a question for you. Do you have to run a TBN slower than a standard ball nose bit? Is the rigidity of the router the main issue? The rigidity of the router is the main issue. And that's another advantage of the tapered ball nose is because of that taper, it's a stouter bit, it's more robust. So you can push it a little bit harder, run it a little bit faster than you can a standard ball nose of the same tip diameter. But that's why I say just kind of experimenting. It's the rigidity of your machine is going to be a huge factor because you will get a little bit of not so much tool deflection, but on some of the smaller, lighter weight home hobby CNCs, I'm not going to mention any brand names, but on some of the smaller, lighter weights, you can actually get some deflection in the x-axis that your router is actually mounted to. So it's some experimentation on your part, and that's why I'm also hesitant to give out any feeds and speeds because everybody's machine is different. So Let's see. Dennis Dye wants to know, should you always use a roughing tool path for 3D carves? I don't always. If I'm using a tapered ball nose, usually I don't. Again, if we go back into the situation that I was talking about in the video that went live this morning, if you're using a standard ball nose bit, then yes, I would definitely do a 3D roughing tool path. If you're using a tapered ball nose bit, it's not usually necessary unless you have a lot of material to get out of there. But usually it's not necessary with a tapered ball nose. And that's part of the beauty of it. That, like I said, that big tapered edge clears away most of the material and allows that ball nose to get in there and just machine away what's left over. So, see, Mary Sampson, howdy. I'm Mark, new to all this. Did you do a program that solves the problem of my tool path chewing up my wood? Does not matter what wood I use. Don't know if I worded the question right. That's pretty open-ended. There are a lot of things that could cause it to chew up the wood. Number one being the feed rate and making sure you have the material secured to the table so that it does not move at all. But if you're running, for instance, a V-carve tool path, slow down your feed rate, and you can always speed it up. Usually, I don't know what kind of controller software you're usually using, but usually you can speed it up on the fly. And sometimes you can slow it down. It just depends. But that would be number one for me. And again, that's why I don't get into feeds and speeds, because every machine and every piece of material is different. It also, it does depend on the wood. Soft woods like pine, fir, spruce, cedar, redwood can be harder to machine than a good hardwood like birch, maple, oak, cherry, something like that, because the softwoods like to peel off in strips and they don't like to cut. The annular rings on pine are harder and denser than the fibers in between the annular rings. So it likes to shred, it likes to rip, it doesn't like to cut 100% of the time. Just practice on scrap, slow down your feed rate. You know, I start at 40 inches per minute and increase it as time goes by. So, let's see. Richard Weiss wants to know, what's the difference in time between using just a tapered ball nose and doing a roughing pass and a regular ball nose. Looking at it, just stepping back and not even thinking about the model that you're carving, using a regular ball nose, all things being equal, if you're using the same feed rate and the same step over, using a roughing tool path than a standard ball nose, the finishing tool paths are both going to take about the same amount of time. There's not going to be there shouldn't be any difference in time on the finishing tool paths. So if you're using a roughing tool path first, you're adding the amount of time that it takes to do that roughing tool path. So if it takes 15 minutes to do a roughing tool path and then 2 hours to do the finishing tool path, whether you're using a tapered ball nose or a standard ball nose, is going to be about the same. So you're just adding the time it takes to do a roughing. So if you don't mind that, if you're doing just a single project and there's no time crunch here, and you don't mind being out in the shop for another 20 minutes or half hour or however long it takes for that roughing tool path, then, you know, by all means. And you can use a roughing tool path with a tapered ball nose. It's just the advantage of the tapered ball nose is you don't necessarily have to. So, but generally speaking, whether you're using a standard ball nose or a tapered ball nose, the finishing toolpath should take about the same amount of time. So, yeah, Dave Gatton has a great point there, Mary Sampson. Do you have a spindle or you have a router? And if you have a spindle, is it running clockwise or counterclockwise? And which way is it supposed to run? Because spinning that bit backwards could tear it up, but that would also include some burning, wouldn't it, Dave? I would think so. So yeah, I would check to make sure your spindle direction is correct if you are using a spindle versus a router. So, but so let's see who has joined us since. I think I mentioned Richard Weiss and Bob P. Dennis Dye, I know I mentioned you. Welcome aboard, y'all. Dennis Dye, I know I mentioned you. Alan Prince. Let's see. Alan Prince says, I'm going to try carving my military insignia, Royal Engineers. What would be a good starting speed for a 1/32 ball nose? 1/32 ball nose is incredibly tiny. Um, a good starting speed, you'll have to do the conversion because I think in inches per minute. I don't think in millimeters per second or millimeters per minute. But I always start conservative on something that tiny. Um, with a 1/32 inch tip, I would probably start somewhere in the 30 inches per minute category and see how that goes. If you're using, let's see, I don't know if it's a tapered ball nose or if it's a regular ball nose. If it's a regular ball nose, I would definitely do a roughing tool path. And on the roughing tool path, use a machining allowance that leave about 30 thousandths of an inch machining allowance. That way, your ball nose is only removing about 30 thousandths of an inch of material. That's what that machining allowance is for. So, what is, see, Scott Wilson wants to know what's the best wood to use to carve a 3D image. Well, what kind of wood you got and what kind of wood you want. That's kind of like asking what's the best color to paint. I mean, it's there's a lot of options open. I prefer to use hardwoods, and it just depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something that's going to be mainly painted, I go for the most boring, bland maple I can find. And in fact, that's real good for if you're engraving photos that you're going to go back and stain or paint or something like that. I find the most boring maple that I can find. Not a lot of figure because you don't want that grain to distract from the photo. And if it's going to be mainly paint, why get a bunch of nice, beautiful figure or bird's eyes or quilting in there if you're just going to cover it with paint? Cedar will work. Here's something that I have learned through a lot of my experimentation is to use the raster toolpath and set your raster angle at 45 degrees. That way you're not cutting with the grain, you're not cutting completely across the grain. You're just kind of, it's enough with the grain that you don't get a lot of tooling marks, but it's also enough against the grain or across the grain that it's cutting cleanly. I do some machining in cedar, and cedar cuts real well. But do know that you'll be getting quite a bit of fuzzies at first and maybe around harsh edges. But cedar does carve nice. For those of you watching the video after the fact in the live chat, he said he was using cedar. Scott did. So, yeah, Cedar does carve nice. I think I have a video on one of my first 3D carvings. I think it's number 21, where I showed my entire workflow, and that was carving an aromatic cedar. Which, pro tip, if you carve aromatic cedar, you will want to use a respirator, because that bit gets in there and starts cutting those oils. You will get run out the shop. Let's see. Dennis Dye says, maybe off topic, but do you recommend using a feed and speed calculator? Do you have a favorite? I see lots of software around that says it will help. I talked about that in my video that went out live this morning on how I adjust my feeds and speeds, and that is basically by eye and ear. I start real conservative, usually 40 to 60 inches per minute, depending upon what I'm cutting and the size of my bit. And then I adjust from there. I use Mach 3 controller software, and I can increase the feed rate on the fly. So as it's cutting and I see how it's cutting, if it looks like it can be sped up, I'll start speeding it up. So I may start at 40, but I may end up cutting it at 120 inches per minute. It just depends on how the wood is cutting, because every piece of material is a little bit different. Even in hard maple, you can have different densities in the same piece. So I just make sure that I'm cutting chips, not dust, and that I'm not getting any bit deflection or bit chatter. And that just depends. So I know that's a long answer. The short answer is I don't have a favorite feed and speed calculator. I don't use one. I don't think there's a perfect feed and speed. It's like I said, well, the manufacturers, and they'll tell you that on their pages, those feeds and speeds are starting points only. Adjust them to your machine and adjust them to your material, because there's no single feed and speed that's going to be, yes, use this feed and speed with this bit, because every piece of material is different. So, you know, their calculations for feeds and speeds are based on heavy duty industrial machines that can move at 3, 4, 5, 600 inches per minute. So they have no problem pushing a 1/4 inch bit through hard maple at 200 inches a minute to get the right chip load. I do. Mine won't do that, so I don't even try. I just start it slow, and it will tell me what it's happy running at. So let's see. Alan Prince, how do you clean up the wood after carving? I use sanding brushes. That is in that same video. I'll link that in the description after this goes live. I did a 3D carving in some cedar, a very small little piece. It's episode 21. And I use a sanding brush chucked in my drill. And sometimes, if it doesn't take much, I'll use my cordless drill. If I'm going to be there a while, I'll chuck it in my corded drill, so I don't burn up battery. And just it's a abrasive brush. I was using too fine a grit. I use a 180 and a 240 grit now. And it cleans them up real nice. If there's a lot of real intricate carvings in there, I'll use the Scotch-Brite rotary discs on my Dremel. They work a treat, and I'll put a link to some of those in the description. I need to do a video on those. Next V-carving project, I'll get in there and show how I clean up a project. So let's see. Scott Wilson says it's going to take 12 hours to do it. Can I speed that up, and how? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of it depends on your feed rate. A lot of it depends on how big the project is. But the bottom line is 3D carving takes time. My longest carve so far has been 14 hours. There's a guy in the hashtag CNC router tips uh, Facebook group who is over, he's in Europe. I believe he's in Germany. And his longest carve, he posted photos. It was over 24 million lines of G code, and it was a 54-hour cut on an industrial machine. So 3D carvings just take time. You've got to figure that the step over of that little bitty ball nose tip being anywhere from 8 to 10%, that step over, it may only be moving 5 thousandths to 8 thousandths of an inch per pass. So if it's a 24-inch diameter plaque, it's going to take time at 5 thousandths of an inch per pass. 3D carvings just take time, and there's not really anything you can do about that. I mean, you can speed it up a little bit depending upon feed rate. Like I said, adjust on the fly. Also, it just depends on the size of the carving. So there may or may not be a way to speed that up. So let's see. Big Dave Clemens in the house. Howdy, Dave. Keith Hurley. Yes, sir. Stiff nylon bristle brushes for cleaning up the projects can do a lot. They can do a lot, believe me. Let's see. David Crook. What is the rule of thumb if you're producing dust or not chips? Speed up the feed rate or slow down the feed rate? Speed up the feed rate. If you're creating dust, what it's doing is it's cutting a chip out of the wood, and then the other flute of the bit is coming around and cutting that chip before it gets kicked out. So you're basically recutting the same chip over and over, which is another reason why I tend to not use 4 flute bits on wood, because you're just keep grinding up and keep chopping up the same chips before they can get extracted out, because a router spins just basically too fast for a 4 flute bit. And I know in the video this morning I said I will make an exception to that with a ball nose, a tapered ball nose bit, usually because they're not removing that much material. They're taking just very thin, very small pieces out. So when you're doing 3D carving, you're generally making dust anyway, because the chips are so small, because you're only moving over, your step over is not that big. So, but if you're making dust, you need to speed up your feed rate, or on the other side, you can slow down your spindle or router RPMs. So on that score, I use a Porter Cable Model 890 router. I don't have a spindle. I'm going to get one eventually, but not until I get in a new shop. And it's variable speed, but I have it set at about 16,000 RPM, and I don't touch it from there. So I do all of that with my feed rate. I don't really adjust the router RPMs. I mean, except for a few things. I will, if I'm doing a large diameter bit, then yeah, I'll slow it down to about 12,000 and then adjust my feed rate. But that's to keep the edges of that larger bit, the outside diameter, from, breaking the sound barrier as it's spinning. So, okay, let's see. Brian Schoenecker. I hope I didn't just butcher your name. Do you have any recommendations on a shop size versus the size of the CNC machine? I need enough space to be able to work, but I don't want to rent a space too big. I'm thinking of a machine 4x8 or 5x10. Do I have a recommendation for the shop size? I would say take the size of the machine that you're looking at, double it, and that's what you'll need around the machine. Just simply because, based on experience, I'm in an 8x12 garden shed. So I've got a outside dimension of 96 inches wide, and I have about a 60-inch wide CNC inside. So right there, that's only 36 inches of difference. But split that 36 by 2. I've got 18 inches per side. So getting around my CNC is a chore. And that's why I don't show myself doing it, because I have to get real acrobatic at times. If my walls were finished, I wouldn't be able to get to the back side of the CNC. So, I have to go in between studs and what have you. So using, handling materials, using carts and this, that, and the other, I would take whatever the footprint of the machine is and double it. Just that way you can get around it. I mean, just as a general rule, because you will want to get to either side and around to the back side, believe me. Just, if this is not something that you can shove into the corner of a room. You will want to get into that corner, trust me. Probably about 10 minutes after you get it moved over into that corner, if your luck is anything like mine. So, yeah, when it comes to shop sizes, go big or go home. I don't know that you can rent a space too big, because you will be storing materials. So, of course, then again, it's real easy for me to spend other people's money. I'm an expert at it. So, if you're looking at a 4x8 or a 5x10, you will cuss yourself out if you don't get something at least double the footprint of that machine. So, okay, Scott Wilson, 12 hours isn't so bad then? No, 12 hours in the great grand scheme of things isn't so bad. So, like I said, my longest carve so far has been 14. And basically what I did was I got all the prep work done first, and then let it sit there overnight, came back out, reset XYZ0 with my touch plate, and did the 3D finishing carve in one bump all in one day. So it was still some exciting times out in the shop, but I had other things to do. So that kind of kept me going. So yeah, and you see, and I've had a couple of people email me. I answered a couple of emails this morning with folks asking about pricing 3D work. It is very difficult to price 3D work because, as you're seeing right now, Scott, a 12-hour carve time, how do you charge for that? Oops, sorry about that. How do you charge for that? I mean, normal shop rate around here is $60 an hour. Multiply that by 12, folks aren't going to want to pay that much. So you have to take a lot of loss on your shop time to make 3D carving profitable. So the only way you can really make it profitable is to be doing other things at the same time, so that you're not dedicated to just standing there watching the machine carve. One of the projects that I'm going to be doing later next year in the spring is I'm going to be making some custom moldings for here in the house. And the only way I can make this really profitable is to be making the molding for the house while I'm cutting some plinth blocks on the CNC. Because otherwise I would just be standing there watching this thing cut plinth blocks. So if I'm doing something else at the same time, it's quote unquote profitable. The only way the big companies, the big production companies, make any money doing 3D carving is they have these huge high-speed duplicating CNCs that'll have up to, I've seen videos from some of these Asian companies where they'll have 5, 6, 7, 8, up to and including 20 spindles, 20 spindle heads, all carving at the same time. And then they'll have 30 or 40 of those machines. So they're cutting hundreds of parts at the same time. And that's the only way they can sell their products for as cheaply as they can sell them. So the old stereotype of the little old man sitting there with a chisel carving it for 15 cents an hour just is not true. They've got warehouses full of these machines running 24/7, just carving out hundreds and hundreds of pieces simultaneously. So, Profit? What's profit? Profit is what you wish you were making. So, Alan Prince, is my full time day job woodworking? No, my full time day job is trying to keep up with the list of projects my wife has for me. Speaking of which, another project that'll be coming up after the new year will be a printer's bookcase that I'm going to cut on the CNC just to show it, just to show how it's done. And because my little my little benchtop table saw won't handle cutting a full sheet of plywood. So we can look forward to that for folks that want to make cabinetry with the CNC. Uh, Short answer, Alan, I'm retired. I retired last year, and this is it. This is what I do now. I do YouTube and projects around the house, and I think I may need to go out and get a job just so I can get some rest. So, were there any other questions about today's video or anything else? We've been running right about a half hour here. Let's see, Boris. I am not going to attempt to pronounce your name because I don't want to butcher it, and I don't want. I have too much respect for folks. Um, Thank you for your channel. He says, "Thank you very much for watching. I just hope you're finding some of the videos useful, and hope you're getting something out of the content." Alan is a farmer. You know, there's a lot of times I wish I was a farmer until I see some of the work, and I'm glad I'm not. But I come from a long line of farmers way back. Boris wants to know, do I have any experience with soft metals? No, I do not. As far as advice is concerned, I would go over to NYCNC, excuse me, NYC CNC's YouTube channel, go back to some of their older videos, and watch. The guy's name is John Saunders. Watch his videos. He's a professional. I'm not a metal guy. I've never tried to engrave or cut aluminum or anything. I'd like to one day. I just haven't gotten to that point yet to where I need to do a project. So, see, Richard Weiss, just lost you, so I'm going to leave. Thanks for everything you do. Well, thank you, Richard. I do appreciate it. So, okay, I guess I'm going to go ahead and end this one for this week. I don't see any further questions on today's video or anything else. Been running a little over a half an hour. So I'd like to try to keep these at somewhere around a half an hour and not the... Before I close out, I'll tell you a little story about that. Not last week, but the week before. I ended up with a 3-hour live stream after this, after I shut down and went off the air. And it turns out what had happened was I start my encoding software and I preview the live stream, make sure everything is set up, and I go away. Well, turns out my encoding software was recording all of that, and when I went live, it posted a 3.5-hour video. So I had to go back and edit out 3 hours of me coming in and out of the room, drinking coffee, watching YouTube videos and stuff like that, waiting for the live stream time. So hopefully that doesn't happen this time. So, thank you. Let's see here. I got one here from Wally's Tool Shed. I'm still having problems cleaning up vectors when converting JPEG to SVG. All of a sudden, there's a ton of nodes. How do I get rid of most of them without destroying the project? I don't know which software you're using. I'm using Vectric Aspire now. I used to use VCarve Pro. If you're using VCarve Pro or Aspire, I did a video I will link in the description below. I don't remember off the top of my head which one it was. I'll go back and find it. Where on how to get rid of unnecessary nodes using VCarve Pro or Aspire. And it's very simple. But if you're using something else like Inkscape or any of the other, I really have no clue. I know the software I use, and that's about it, to be honest with you. VCarve Pro 10, yes, okay, perfect. I will put a link in the description below to that video on how to remove unnecessary nodes or points, and that should help you out big time. So give me about 10 minutes after this goes live here. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and close this one out, and I will see you next week. I have no idea what the video is going to be yet. I'll be brainstorming this afternoon. I may get back into zero plane, or I may get back into the molding toolpath. We'll see what happens. But other than that, thank you all for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Y'all have a nice Sunday. Get out there and make some chips and have some fun. Thank you all for watching. I really do appreciate it.